I think that this idea that recovery can be ongoing doesn't have to be a bad thing. I think that framing our views on recovery as an ongoing aspect of our lives can actually challenge us to keep being better and to hopefully stay better. And so giving ourselves grace in those moments where we slip up is just super important. And so I think that's especially true in the eating disorder field, which has for so long pushed full recovery for everyone, even though there's not even a consensus definition of what full recovery looks like. So I think particularly for those in the eating disorder field who are in the receiving end of that message that full recovery is the end all be all, you need to sort of define recovery for yourself. And if full recovery is not really a term that resonates with you, then figure out what language you want to use so that you can define recovery on your own terms.
Hello and welcome back to Healing and Growing Hand in Hand podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Tickle, and our guest today is Mallary Tenore Tarpley. I said that right, didn't I? I'm going to read her biography. It's kind of a long one, but it's very interesting. So Mallary is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas at Austin School of Journalism and Media and McCombs School of Business, where she teaches writing and reporting courses for undergraduate and graduate students. Mallary specializes in a variety of topics, including long-form feature writing, creative nonfiction, solutions journalism, and nonprofit journalism. A longtime journalist, Mallary's articles and essays have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Dallas Morning News, the Tampa Bay Times, Teen Vogue, Harvard University's Neiman Storyboard, and more. She also maintains a weekly newsletter, Right at the Edge, where she shares writing tips and best practices. So welcome, Mallary. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I am too. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your upcoming book?
Sure. So, A Slip is a memoir that weaves together my own personal narrative alongside research and reporting that I did. So, it really looks at how I developed a childhood eating disorder after my mother died of metastatic breast cancer when I was 11. And it follows my diagnosis, my treatment for the eating disorder. I was in and out of treatment, both in the hospital and in residential care for many years, and then looks at my recovery from that. It sort of delves into this brief period where I considered myself fully recovered, and then really explores what I call the middle place, which is essentially this name I've given to this liminal space in between acute sickness and full recovery. And so many of the books on eating disorders that I've read have really been told from the perspective of people who are fully recovered. And yet, I don't think we have enough conversations about the messiness and ongoing nature of recovery. And so for me, it was really important to explore these questions of what does it mean to be better, but not all better? And what does it mean to live in this world knowing that your disorder remains a vulnerability? So much of the book looks at my own experiences with this, but I also surveyed over 700 people with lived experience, and I interviewed, interviewed about 175 survey respondents and clinicians and researchers. So I weave all of that into the book to really offer up a variety of different perspectives and outlooks on eating disorders and recovery from them.
Wow, you've really done your research. That's amazing. That's amazing. 700 people. Okay. So you kind of touched on what we're going to talk about today, which is we are going to talk about the eating disorders and I like how you put this, the messiness and ongoing nature of recovery, which you were just kind of mentioning that. And you're right. And so much in our trauma healing, there's that messiness that we go through, like we're not quite there yet, but we can't go back to where we were, and we don't know what to do with ourselves in between. So I know that's a lot of people get really discouraged. That's when we can tend to get really discouraged during those times. So I'm really glad that we're going to talk about this, especially, and we were talking about this before we got on, we started recording, but eating disorders, it's not talked about enough. And I mentioned to you that when I was a kid, I didn't know anybody who had an eating disorder. And so it's interesting that it's so prevalent now. And I think so much of it is because we're just not educated on it.
Yes, we know so much more about eating disorders now than we did years ago, even when I was in treatment in the late 90s. But we still have a long way to go. But part of what I was interested in looking at was just the evolution of care and treatment and also the evolution of research. We know so much more
Yeah.
now about the neurobiology of eating disorders and the genetic components and so many other aspects. And so I think that that leads to just a greater collective understanding of how these disorders play out and also why it's so hard to recover from them.
So let's get started. And if you don't mind kind of sharing your story, however much you feel like sharing about your eating disorder and the messiness, and then, of course, your healing journey.
Sure. So I developed my eating disorder, like I said, after my mom died. And I didn't call it an eating disorder at the time. I really was intent on trying to stay small in the aftermath of my mother's death because after she died, I really tried to put on a happy face. I pretended that I was okay. I tried to move about my life as though I wasn't dealing with this horrible loss. And the more time passed, the more I felt myself just feeling distant from my mother. And I didn't know how to grapple with that. So I really tried to stay small. And I thought maybe if I stayed the same size my mother was when she was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. And my most recent memories of my mother were of her in the hospital, not eating because of the chemotherapy treatments. She just had wasted away. And those were my most accessible memories of her. And so when I developed anorexia, I then was also in the hospital wasting away. And there was this weird parallel between what my mother experienced and then what I experienced. And for a brief time, that experience of being in the hospital in some ways did make me feel closer to her. But over time, especially as I got sicker, the eating disorder really left me feeling farther away from my mother than ever before. And so I was treated at Boston Children's Hospital in Massachusetts 5 times, twice on the medical unit and 3 times on the psychiatric ward. I also had been struggling with a lot of the comorbidities that are common among people with eating disorders. So was diagnosed with anxiety and depression and obsessive compulsive disorder and was really rotating in and out of the hospital. The hospitalizations were helpful in many ways, but they didn't give me enough time really to work on the underlying issues. So I did end up going to residential treatment for 1.5 years, where I really began to grieve my mother's death and work toward my recovery. So residential treatment was pivotal for me. But after I left, I went back home and just felt like I had to be perfect at my recovery.
Yeah.
And I was really just intent on being fully recovered, and yet I really didn't even know what that meant. And I just kept thinking that I could not make one wrong move because I was petrified that if I made a mistake or if I slipped into any old behaviors, that I would immediately get sick after the fact. And so it was really just scary and also exhausting trying to uphold this identity as this fully recovered girl. And it really just came to a head in college, my freshman year, when for the first time alone in my dorm room, I binged and I just ate a lot of food uncontrollably. I did not know why that had happened, and I didn't know that that's actually common for people who have had anorexia to sometimes go on to develop other eating disorder behaviors. And so I ended up in this really vicious binging and restricting cycle that lasted well over a decade. But during this time, I continued to uphold this identity as a fully recovered woman because I was too ashamed to admit that I had fallen back into my disorder. And looking back, I really wish that someone, one, had prepared me for the possibility of slips, and that someone had told me that these are a normal part of the process, because I saw every slip as grounds for failure. And many times I would say, well, I slipped this morning, so might as well keep slipping the rest of the day because I've already blown it. And that really left me feeling defeated and very stuck. And so now when I think about my recovery, in the middle place, I give myself a lot more grace when I slip, because even though I've been in recovery for almost 25 years, I still slip.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than looking at that as a failure, I really question that and I say, how can I use this as an opportunity for growth and for learning? And so I think that that reframing of my recovery has been really important. And so many of the people I interviewed for the book said that they could identify with the middle place.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, 85% of the 700 plus people I interviewed said, yes, I can identify with this middle place, and I never had the words to describe it previously. So I think there's a lot of power in naming
Mm-hmm.
something and in removing the stigma and shame that comes with being in recovery as opposed to being fully
Right,
recovered.
right. And that perfectionism in when you're in that when you start your healing journey and I know for me when I had that first kind of aha moment and you just feel like, "Oh, okay, I've arrived." And you don't want to make any mistakes and then you're right. Nobody tells you about that. And I mean, they're starting to talk about that now that the transition period is the hardest. It's that transition between your old life and the new life and it's very messy and it's very difficult and you are going to mess up and you're going to slip up. I just had a slip up last week, in my life where I fully got triggered and I reacted to the trigger before I realized I was being triggered. So we're going to have these moments in our life. Hey, thank you for listening so far. If you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to subscribe so you won't ever miss an episode. So back when you went in, when you said you went into residential and you were in it for what, like a year and a half. So when you got out, was there no support system for you once you got out? Did they really feel like you have arrived, you've healed, you're good to go, you can go live your life?
So it was interesting because I left treatment. And of course, being in residential treatment is unlike any other experience. I mean, it's almost hard to let people know what that was even like because it's so wildly different from life outside of a treatment facility. But I left treatment and essentially went right back home, which doesn't happen as often these
Yeah.
days because now in the eating disorder field, we have sort of a stepped care model where there are more transitional steps in
Mm-hmm.
between residential treatment and going back home. But there really wasn't that at the time. And so I went back home. I was continuing to see a medical doctor on an outpatient basis, and I was still seeing a therapist. But after probably a year or so, I was weaned off the medications that I'd been on for these comorbidities, and I stopped seeing my therapist. I really didn't have to go see the eating disorder doctor anymore. And so everyone thought that I was doing really well, and I was doing well. And I thought, okay, I'm all better now. And I really didn't think that there was any chance that the eating disorder could come back. Looking back on this period, I wish that I had just continued with at least
Yeah.
therapy so that I could use that just as just someone who could be a sounding board and so that I would always have that resource at my disposal because I think sometimes it can be hard when you think I'm fully recovered, I don't need any more help. But I think that if you've had a really serious life-threatening eating disorder, you may need help for the rest of your life, right? And that's not something to be ashamed of. But I really thought I need to be done with therapy. I need to be done with everything associated with the eating disorder. And then when I did end up relapsing, I felt like I couldn't ask for that help because I thought, well, I'm supposed to be all
Yeah.
better. I'm supposed to be beyond
Yeah,
that.
the shame kind of shut that down, didn't it?
Yes.
So I don't know a lot about eating disorders, but what it's sounding like is it almost like someone dealing with alcoholism, like they're always going to have to maintain it for the rest of their life because it sounds like it's a difficult journey. Going through trauma
Mhm.
and healing from it, is tough and it's a lifelong journey, but it sounds like this is much more difficult. Why is that?
So, I mean, for one, I think it's really difficult because we can't abstain from food,
Right.
right? I mean, the alternative is we die. And so, food is so, of course, inherent to our survival, and it is so just integral to our day to day lives. And so, we are constantly faced with the choice of do we eat? Do we not eat?
Mm,
How much do we eat? What do we eat? And so, it's not the same as alcoholism. And I'm not trying to limit or belittle how difficult recovery is from
right.
alcoholism or addiction. It's incredibly difficult, but you don't need alcohol or drugs to survive. So it's a little bit different in that
Right.
sense. And so I think when it comes to eating disorder recovery, that's really challenging. And we also know that there is a genetic component to eating disorders. And
Oh.
so that is something that we can't erase, right? We can't erase our sort of genetic sort of making. And so there's all these different factors that go into eating disorders. And also, when you consider just the society that we live in, it is so steeped in diet culture
Hmm.
and fat phobia. And so it's really difficult to recover into our society just knowing how much emphasis there is on the way we look and the way we carry ourselves and the food that we eat. And we're constantly being bombarded with all this messaging around food and weight. So there's a lot that goes into it. I have certainly talked with folks who consider themselves to be fully recovered. So I don't want to undermine the fact that some people do feel like they've reached this full expression of recovery where the eating disorder really is something that was part of their past and no longer part of their present. But I think that for too long, we've really dismissed this middle place and all of the people in it. And I think that many times clinicians that I've talked to have said, well, it's limiting to say that you're in recovery because then it suggests that full recovery is not possible. And I'm not trying to suggest it's not possible, but I also think that we really need to acknowledge the fact that many people do struggle with their eating disorders in a chronic way and others struggle with aspects of their disorder. So someone like me may be far better than they ever imagined, but they still struggle
Hmm.
sometimes. And so I think that based on the interviews I've done, just this ongoing nature of recovery and the need to work at it day by day is something that many people kind of have to face.
Hey, if you're ready to go deeper in your healing journey, join our 6-week workshop. Sign up today at women's childhood abuse healing workshop.com or click on the link below. I'd love to see you there and help you on your healing journey. So, what I keep thinking about is there a root cause to someone's eating disorder? And it sounds simple that, well, if you get to the root of that, then you should be able to help that person work through that. But then you're right. You've got the complication of we have to eat, and you've got all the nuances of how much do I eat, when do I eat, what do I eat, how much do I eat, all those things. And then there's the whole social aspect of eating as well. So I could see why it would be really complicated. In your case, did you figure out what the root cause of your eating disorder, or is it like multifaceted? I mean, it could be that as well, right?
Yeah, I do think it's multifaceted. I mean, and I don't know if I am genetically predisposed, right? I mean, I may be genetically predisposed to having an eating disorder. I certainly have many of the temperament traits
Mm.
that people with restrictive eating disorders have, and that I am perfectionistic and I am detail oriented and risk averse. Most people with anorexia do share these same temperament
Hmm.
traits, but I think for me, I always used to say that my mother's death caused my eating disorder. But I remember when I was getting my master's of fine arts in creative nonfiction, one of my professors read something where I had said that. And she said, was that the sole reason? And I really began to unpack that question in my writing. And looking back, certainly the suppressed grief was a huge part
Hmm.
of the development of my eating disorder. But also, there were other factors at play. So I began to think about all the other influences in my life at the time. And around the time my mother died, I had been in a health class in middle school where we were weighed in front of classmates and we were taught about nutrition labels and the food pyramid. And the teacher was telling us what we should and shouldn't eat. And as a people pleaser, I really wanted to please the teacher. And I thought, well, I'm going to only eat the foods that she said we should eat, and I'm not going to eat any of the other foods. And I remember trying to control what my father ate, and I would tell him, well, the health teacher said that hamburgers are not healthy, so you shouldn't eat hamburgers. But of course, he kept eating hamburgers, and I realized I couldn't control what he ate, but I realized I could control what I
Hmm.
ate. So there was that influence. And then, interestingly, as a journalist, I kept wondering what were some of the media influences. And after my mother passed away, my father bought me a subscription to 17 magazine, which was a popular teen magazine at the time. And I remember poring over all of those issues, and he thought that maybe the magazine could help answer questions related to girlhood and womanhood that he wouldn't be able to
Oh, bless
answer.
his heart. He meant well.
But
Aw.
I know. And I went back and looked at the first issue that I ever read, and the cover story was titled Girls Who Exercise Themselves to Death. And I
Oh.
went on eBay and I found this particular issue. I got the copy and I read that story, and it was all about girls struggling with anorexia. And I had long since forgotten that story, but as I read it, little parts of it were coming back to me. And so I thought, well, there, I was exposed to that story. And then I looked in the back of the magazine and it was filled with all these ads for fat camps,
Oh
right?
my
And they were being
gosh.
advertised for children as young as 8 years old. So I thought, well, there was that influence too. So I think that there were a lot of different elements at play. I think my mother's death and the way I sort of dismissed my grief was really the major sort of trauma that triggered it.
Mhm.
But there definitely were other influences at play.
That is interesting. I remember that magazine. That's horrifying.
Yes,
That's absolutely horrifying.
it is.
Oh my God. Poor children.
I know. And now we have social
I
media.
know, right? We went from fat camps to now social media where we fat shame everybody. Oh my gosh. So I've got some questions that they're kind of deep, and I thought I would ask you. How did your identity get tangled up in the eating disorder, and what has it been like to untangle yourself from it?
Yes. So I think a lot about this question because I think it's really important to just think about identity because for so long I really believed that I was my eating
Mm-hmm.
disorder. I remember I used to say that I essentially had anorexia, but then I ended up shifting the narrative and saying that I was anorexic. And I really thought that I was defined by my eating disorder, and all the other parts of me really faded into the background. So I've always loved writing, even as a child, but I stopped writing. I did journal, but I wasn't really connected to my writing in the same way. I stopped socializing, so I just didn't want to talk to friends or even family. I stopped reading, and so I really just had to let go of all of these parts of who I
Mm-hmm.
was. And I was really just a shell of my former self. And I remember looking at my old medical records as part of my work on this book. And there was this line from a nurse at Boston Children's Hospital. And it said, Mallory simply stopped growing physically and emotionally after her mother died.
Oh,
And I remember thinking, yes,
yeah.
that's very much true. And so I have really thought about this a lot, and I had no idea about kind of the fact that there are these brain based alterations that happen when one has an eating disorder. And not to get too science based here, but it turns out that adolescence development of self and identity is really closely linked to brain
Mm.
development. So, when adolescents are beginning to establish their adult identity, connections are formed in the brain. And to make these connections, the brain relies on white matter, which is basically made up of something called myelin. And this production of myelin partly relies on a person's dietary fat consumption.
Ah,
So, starvation actually significantly alters the brain's white
there you go.
matter. And yes, these alterations can result in this distorted sense of self and altered neurodevelopment. And so these are kind of underlying brain based factors that scientists are only beginning to understand. But I think that they can help explain why I was so fixated on my anorexic title
Mm-hmm.
all those years ago. And every time I was hospitalized, I felt more worthy of that title.
Mm.
And in this narrative I crafted about myself, my anorexia was really the main character, and everything and everyone else was pushed to the margins. And so for me in my recovery, a big part of it was trying to figure out, how do I reclaim my
Mm-hmm.
identity? How do I actually kind of reconnect with the parts of myself that are beyond the anorexia? And so as I look at my identity now, I sometimes equate it to a pie. And it used to be that anorexia made up every single
Mm-hmm.
slice, but now it still takes up a slice, but there are so many other slices in that pie, right? I see myself as a mother, a wife, a professor, a writer, a friend, a daughter. And so a big part of my recovery has been trying to really embrace those other parts of my
Mm-hmm.
identity so that I can see myself as being far more than the eating disorder.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I could see where anorexia could consume everything because you have to watch everything you do, and it's secretive as well. So then you've got that component with it as well. So I could see how it would consume you and take over everything, every part of your life. And that's what, and it's so interesting how parallel that is to us that are healing from trauma as well. So it's a form of trauma, but it's the same thing that I kind of went through. And I was in survival mode and victim, I had a victim mindset. So I was, doing ordinary things was tough for me because I was just in survival mode. And so it consumes you, and then you do lose your identity. And so I too went on a journey to discover who I was too, and that's really important for all of us to do that. And it's not what someone else tells us that we are, it's what we decide and discover who we are.
Yes, I think that that's so important. And yeah, I think a lot of recovery and healing has to do with reclaiming the parts of ourselves that we
Yeah.
lost. And so they were always there, but probably there were periods where we just couldn't
Yeah,
find
they were
them.
buried pretty deep. They were buried under a lot of other
Yeah.
stuff. So, well, that's a great answer. Thank you. So I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments, your questions about this episode, or really anything that has to do with trauma. So you can comment below, or you can reach out to me at asklisatickle@gmail.com. I'd really looking forward to hearing from you. Did anyone unintentionally make your recovery harder, maybe with helpful comments or praise about your body? And how do you navigate that? And let me just say this. I don't When someone has lost weight, I'll just say I've learned to say you look really healthy. Because when
Hmm.
someone tells me you look really good when I've lost weight, well, what did I look like before?
Yes, yes. I think that that's a really great response because, yes, I have heard women talk about how they're complimented on their weight loss. And someone might say, "Oh, well, what's your secret? You look so
Yeah.
great." And I remember one woman saying, "Well, my secret is anorexia, and it is not a good disorder
Yeah.
to have." That also can be true of cancer
Yeah.
patients who are undergoing treatment. And someone will say, "Well, wow, you look so great. What's your secret?" Well, chemotherapy, right? So I think that we need to be really careful when we're complimenting people on weight loss because we don't know how people lost that
Hmm.
weight. And in many cases, it may not be healthy. And I don't think we recognize that enough because there's just so much push for weight loss in our
Yeah.
society. And yet, there are a lot of people who are struggling with the negative repercussions of that. So, part of it is being sensitive to folks who are really undergoing these bodily changes because of factors that are somewhat outside of their control. So I think for me, I was always really lucky to have a supportive family. I think my family had to really learn how to understand the eating disorder
Hmm.
because eating disorders are quite enigmatic. And I remember my father and my grandmother would sometimes say, "You're so smart, Mallory. Why can't you just figure this out,
Oh,
right?
bless
Why
their
can't you
heart.
just recover?" And I many times would hear them say, "Why can't you just eat?" And as a parent now, I can empathize with them more. I understand where they were coming from. And over time, they learned not to say those
Hmm.
things. Also, when I was in treatment, I had to eat a lot of food to try to regain weight. And I remember my grandmother visiting me at one point and saying, "Wow, that is a lot of
Oh
food."
no.
And so that was not what I needed to hear in that moment. But even in my sort of transitions outside of the hospital, lots of people would say, again, "You look great," because I'd put on weight. But that for me was not
Hmm.
helpful. So comments sort of related to my body were just not helpful, or comments related to the food I was eating, really trying to kind of set me off. So I think that those were comments that were hard to navigate, but certainly my family and I learned how to talk
Hmm.
better about the eating disorder
Hmm.
and how to talk in more productive ways about it. Also, when I was in treatment, I was lucky to be under the care of people who understood eating disorders, but there were times when clinicians would tell me, I promise that you won't get fat. And
Mm,
that now is something that providers typically don't
hmm.
say in eating disorder treatment centers because it is laced with fat phobia. And again, I understand the sentiments behind it, but it can also make people in larger bodies feel really
Yeah.
slighted. And it can also instill this fear in people with eating disorders that, oh my gosh, it's bad. What if I do gain weight? What if I do end up in a larger body? What does that mean? And so I think it's really important to kind of stay away from those comments and really focus more on what it does it mean for your body to be healthy, what does it mean to be nourished and fueled, and to be really specific about the language that we use when we're talking about recovery and illness.
Yeah, I mean, what do you suggest? Like, what would you suggest the best answer or the best response would be? Because if you walk up to somebody who you just met and you don't know that there's something going on in their life or whatever, what would be the right response? Because I want to say the right thing.
Yes. Are you asking the right response to kind of noticing maybe a
Yes,
change in their
and
weight
how they
or?
look. Yes.
Yes. So I would say that sometimes you don't need to say anything,
Hmm.
right? I mean, certainly if you've noticed that they have lost a lot of weight and they look emaciated or they look like they're underweight and you're concerned, I think if you notice those changes in someone's weight and you also notice that the person perhaps has become more isolated
Yeah.
or they're really not eating much or maybe they're running off to the bathroom every time they finished a meal, if you're noticing that, I think it's really important to say
Hmm.
something and to just not accuse them of having an eating disorder, but just say, I've noticed that your weight has changed and I've noticed that you've retreated inward and you're not really seeming to enjoy food as much as you used to. So I just want to let you know that I'm here if you need to talk and I am someone who you can trust if you feel like you want to kind of explain what's happening. And so I think that's really important. But otherwise, I would say you don't really need to comment on someone's
Yeah.
weight.
Yeah.
If you feel compelled to do so, you could say, "Oh, I you look so happy," or "You
Yeah.
really look like you're just glowing,"
Yeah.
right? And sort of shift the focus to maybe the way that their expression looks as opposed to the size of their
Right, more how
body.
they're presenting themselves, right? That's a great
Yes.
idea. You're really I love that because yeah, you're right. We shouldn't even. You're right because I was sitting there thinking even what I was saying, I meant well, but it still could be interpreted wrong, and we are so focused on weight and size and all of that. So that's yeah. You look like you're glowing. What are you doing that's so wonderful? I don't know, something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, just don't focus on the weight, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So here's one more. What do people often misunderstand about the word recovery? We kind of touched on a little bit. What's the myth you most want to bust?
I want to bust the myth that recovery is a straight line with a finish line at the end. I really used to think that recovery was the series of straight arrows that led to a final destination. And now I tend to think more of recovery as the series of circles that shrink or grow in size depending on life's ebbs and
Mm,
flows. So maybe when you slip, the size of that circle shrinks a little bit. But then once you get back up, it grows in size, right? And those circles ideally are moving in a forward direction, but they are not really having a finish line, right? They're moving in a forward direction. They're pointing toward more recovery, but they are going to keep growing over time, hopefully. And so I think that this idea that recovery can be ongoing doesn't have to be a bad thing. I
yeah.
think that framing our views on recovery as an ongoing aspect of our lives can actually challenge us to keep being better and to hopefully stay better. And so giving ourselves grace in those moments where we slip up is just super
Yeah.
important. And so I think that's especially true in the eating disorder field, which has for so long pushed full recovery for
Mm,
everyone, even though there's not even a consensus definition of what full recovery looks
yeah.
like. So I think, particularly for those in the eating disorder field who are on the receiving end of that message that full recovery is the end all be all, you need to sort of define recovery for yourself. And a full recovery is not really a term that resonates with you, then figure out what language you want to use so that you can define recovery on your own terms.
Yeah, because, and really our healing journey is, I believe we're on that journey until we take our last breath. We have measures of
Yes, me
healing,
too.
and and we have those moments that we slip up. And you're right. The thing about giving ourselves grace is so important, because think about this. If you had a loved one that slipped up, would you treat them the way that you're treating yourself? No. You would give them grace. You would give them understanding. You would support them. And that's exactly what we need to do to ourselves. We can be so incredibly hard on ourselves. We don't need to keep that up.
Yes, yeah, it's so true. We just need to be gentler with
Yeah.
ourselves like we would with our children or a loved one.
Yeah, we don't even, until someone stopped and really brought that to my attention, it was shocking. And then I started paying attention to how I was treating myself, and it's shocking how awful I was treating myself. And I didn't even think about it. It didn't even cross my mind. Didn't even cross my mind.
Yes. Yeah.
So I've got two more questions for you. What parts of your healing journey were the most unexpected, either in pain or in power?
That's a really great question. So I think that probably in terms of power, it makes me think about just meeting my partner, who's now my husband. And I was really afraid of letting him know about my experiences with an eating disorder because when I met him, I was still struggling with binging and restricting, and I really hadn't told anyone. And so I was afraid that if I opened up to him and made myself vulnerable, that he would run away,
Yep.
right? And just like so many other guys, they didn't run away because I had told them about my eating disorder, but they just didn't want a relationship, and I did, and various other things. But once I did tell my husband about my eating disorder when we were still dating, he really embraced me and said, "I'm so glad that you shared that with me, and I want to help you work through this."
Oh.
And so it was just really this huge relief
Mm-hmm.
to one, just be vulnerable and to know that it was met with loving kindness. And I think I felt really comfortable telling him because he had opened up to me about his dad passing away when he was 14.
Mm.
And then I was able to tell him about my mom dying when I was 11. And so we had already sort of shared some narratives that were a little bit harder.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt like I could trust him with this narrative and really open up to him. And what that did for me was it made it harder to keep the eating disorder secret and
Mm-hmm.
hidden because one, we were spending more time together, but two, he knew this about me now. And so I really couldn't hide it in the ways that I once did. And so I think that often our secrets keep us sick and they keep
Yeah.
us stuck. And so the more we can really share our experiences with someone who we really trust, I think the more we can make meaningful progress forward. So for me, that was really helpful.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sounds like you married a winner.
I did, yes. I'm
Oh,
lucky.
I did too the third time. It took me 3 tries, but I married. Yeah, I married. I call him my normal. He's a guy that I can pass things through and say, "Is that normal?" um,
Yes, yes. That's so
it's
helpful.
exactly has been hugely helpful. As a matter of fact, it helped me with my trigger last week. Um, and the last question I'll ask you is, well, there's actually two more, but what do you want to leave our listeners with?
So I would love to just let your listeners know that it is really helpful to think about how can you make choices in service of your recovery and how can you celebrate every little win that you
Mm-hmm.
have because there are days when I make a choice that is in service of recovery and I think, oh, there's just a little choice. That's really not a big deal. But I think that anytime we are choosing more recovery, that's worthy of
Yes.
celebration. And I think that we need to recognize that. And rather than thinking in terms of full recovery, I do tend to think in terms of more recovery. Maybe that more recovery is just 1% one day. Maybe the next day it's more like
Right.
10%. But anything we do that is helping us to move forward, I think is important, because so often we fixate on the slip ups and we fixate on the mistakes we
Mm-hmm.
made and the things that were wrong. And then that can lead us to spiral. And so I think the more we can really recognize these moments when we are trying to move forward and when we are making choices that serve us well, that's really important. And it's worth talking about. It's worth just sort of recognizing ourselves and appreciating kind of what we did. And I think that I've learned to do that more and more, and that has helped my recovery to feel less deficit based and more strength based.
I'm glad you chose that answer because that's so true that and when we're, going through our healing and treatment, it's, we are focusing on the negative. We tend to go and focus on the negative, and we're not seeing those baby steps that we've taken that are they may be small, but they're so profound and so helpful in our healing. And it's important to do this celebrating of even the little things, because that's one step closer. It's one step away from where you were and one step closer to where you want to be. So I'm really glad you shared that. Thank you. That was wonderful. So Mallory, if people want to reach out to you, how could they connect with you? And then of course this will be in the show notes as well. And then how we could get your book as well, because it's not out yet as of the recording of this podcast.
Yes. So I have a weekly Substack newsletter. It's just my first name, Mallary, Mallary.substack.com. And I share a lot of writing related tips. And then I am pretty active on Instagram, and that's just my full name, Mallary Tenore Tarpley. And my book Slip will be out on August 5th. You can buy it wherever you buy books. So Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, your local independent bookstore. And it is available for pre-order now. So I hope your listeners will check it out. It does address eating disorders, of course, but also really looks at motherhood and grief
Mm.
and what it means to take a more inclusive approach to recovery. So I think there's a lot of points of relatability for your listeners.
And there's one thing I didn't mention that is so true, and it's been scientifically proven how much writing helps you in your healing recovery as well.
Yes, it's been hugely helpful
I
for me.
bet, I bet, because I'm not a huge writer, but I've done some writing in my time, and that has been a huge help for me. And it kind of gets everything out of here and onto paper, and you know, it's not so
Yes.
heavy anymore. So, well, Mallory, thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for sharing the wisdom about the eating disorders and enlightening us on really how to kind of manage them if those of us that have them, or I don't have one, those that have it, and those that are maybe dealing with someone who is struggling with one.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for caring about this issue and for having me on the
Yeah,
show.
no, this fits right, unfortunately, in the whole trauma, umbrella. So, but thank you.